Welcome to the Critical Media Studies Podcast. We're your hosts, Mike Rapici
and Barry Falk.
Dr. Rapici, how are you this evening?
Dr. Falk, I'm doing well, Barry. How are you?
Good. I'm doing well as well.
Kind of full of beans. I'm sorry to interrupt you. I'm kind of full of beans now that I'm thinking about it.
Are you really? Are you?
I think so.
That's our typical thing. It's because you're a new stan. We have another Canadian that we're stans of now.
I think we should probably consider changing the intro music to something more Canadian.
to Canada.
And I don't say that sarcastically, to be honest with you. I think
yes.
I am a fan. I don't know that I'm ready to say I'm a super fan yet, but I thought that tonight was without even introducing Mr. Harold Innis.
We haven't even said anything.
I'm a fan. I thought there was a lot of interesting thought underpinning these ideas, and that was good. But I'll let you do the introductions as you do them.
Let me just give some background to our praise. We're talking about Minerva's a 1947 presidential address by a Canadian economic historian, Harold Innis. The chapter or essay address, Minerva's Owl, was collected in a book a couple of years later, along with an appendix that we're going to talk about fairly extensively, by Innis, collected into a book called The Bias of Communication. And he also has another kind of path-breaking media studies book called, I think, Empire in Media, I believe is the title of it. But just a couple other words about Innis. Now, we were joking or not joking about our affection for Canada and renaming critical media studies to Canadian media studies. But, we do talk, as any listener knows, we do talk a lot about Marshall McLuhan. And in talking about Harold Innis tonight, it's worth noting that, yes, he is Canadian, but also we can, with the presence of Innis and McLuhan at the University of Toronto, we can honestly talk about a Toronto tradition in media studies and communication studies, because McLuhan, particularly as we're going to talk about tonight and elucidate, I think the first part of our episode tonight, we're going to try to give a broad overview of Harold Innis's unique contributions to media studies. And it's important to note that he's a major Canadian economic historian who, at near the end of his career, kind of got the media idea. And since we mentioned McLuhan, it's worth noting that McLuhan points to Innis as one of the main inspirations, or was someone who guided him and inspired him to think about media and communications. In fact, putting together what I kind of now know about McLuhan, after reading that wonderful book, Distant Early Warning, by Alex Kitnick, I think it's fair to say that between the British modernism that was very communication oriented and very semiotic, the particular kind of a take on modernism exemplified by painter as well as writer and vorticist and polemicist Wyndham Lewis, you put that together with the historical overview of Harold Innis, and you kind of have the building blocks of McLuhan-esque media theory. So there's that. Something you would like to add? I have another thing to pivot to.
No, I think
in this first part of it, but if there's something you want to add now, please do.
No, I think that's right, and I think that's what's particularly alluring or impressive to me about this. It's not so much that he has an argument that I'm fond of, it's his framework in terms of just how he's looking at sort of the the mechanisms that balance power or that define you know the, the 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 ways in which culture shifts. And so excuse me, I found that particularly engaging.
And you know your comment. I don't want to interrupt you, or
No, no,
in the thought. Uh, I'm going to continue giving sort of prologue information, but what you just said. Let me throw this out to listeners now. Um, in a nutshell, let's see if we can do this in a nutshell, and then we'll expand. In a nutshell, what Innes is doing with history is putting three things in dialogue with each other. I'm recapitulating for listeners, Michael, your insight in our pre-meeting, that there are three things that, so Innes is coming at this particular topic as an economic historian. But in the bias in communication and his later work, there's a shift so that he's always triangulating three things. And that, I think, is basically what we're going to be talking through tonight: the articulation, the relation between three major ideas. So this gives his version of history a unique inflection. So what are the three big ideas? That at any point in history, there is a kind of triangulation, interrelation, if you don't want to use the geometrical metaphors, between three elements: power, knowledge, and technology. And according to our friend, Harold, our new Canadian friend, Harold Innis, these things have to be in equilibrium. So these three things are present. There has to be an equilibrium. And there is in the line, one last thing on this. In the line of, he's writing, this is 1940s, 1950s. This is still an era where the world historians, the historians of world systems like Oswald Spengler, Arnold Toynbee, and others, that kind of world historical view, which was, world view of history, an attempt to think about world history with an enlarged timeline, but also an enlarged geographic frame, moving away from the national into a different kind of, into thinking about the global, right? That this, he's trying to do what used to be called universal history.
mm-hmm,
That's
mm-hmm.
basically a universal human history. And a lot of these, Spengler's, the title of Oswald Spengler's universal history kind of gives the game away: the decline of the West, and that he is thinking of like big terms, big categories, like West and the Occident and the Orient and things like that. Yeah, problematic categories now, but just the thing I'm noting is that there is this new idea of an expansive history. So um, when you're talking about so much data, you have to find a way to frame it.
Mm-hmm.
And basically, not only is he talking about empires, he feels that Innes feels that by tracing the changing relation between these three things, power, knowledge, and technology, you basically can kind of map out the fate of empires, how
Well,
empires consolidate, how they sustain or fail to sustain.
see, I think that I want to just make one amendment to my understand. I want to, no, maybe that's not the right way to say it. I want to, I understand that just with one slight caveat to that, I think.
Okay.
And this is part of what I really like about this.
Mm-hmm.
I think it's important to note that Innes is arguing that you've got these three sort of factors, these three forces, as you said, that when they're in equilibrium, You have a balanced, functioning society or empire. Like this is what it takes if power and knowledge and technology are appropriately balanced, then a culture will sustain itself. Is that fair to
Right.
say?
Yeah.
Right. But what I find particularly interesting about this is that when an empire collapses or is weakened, it doesn't cease to exist.
Hmm.
Its composition changes essentially. Its role, its efficacy globally is altered. And the thing that sort of came to mind for me, and this is, I'm not trying to connect these, this is just as a little model, for example. If you think
Hmm.
about Raymond Williams's, emergent, dominant, residual, right? The three sort of
Right. Another
forces,
triangulation
another
theory.
triangulation. Those are three distinct phases with periods of overlap from the residual to the dominant and then from the dominant to the emergent, right? Like each is an outgrowth of what came before it. And that's how
Hmm.
you have progress.
Hmm.
What I find interesting about Innis is that power, knowledge, and technology, and we'll get to this in the appendix, are all sort of mutually self-informing and determining, right? Like you don't have power without the composition, the interactions of knowledge and technology. So in a way, it becomes a much more complicated matrix than something like Williams, where it's just sort of this linear progression. You have these three parts that progress. This is more complicated than that, and I like that. Typically, I really appreciate simplicity. Um, but what I like about this is that because it's not a case that one fails or one grows
Hmm.
too overbearing. It's sort of how these three forces interact with each other
Hmm.
to create some sort of balance.
Hmm.
And because we're not looking at either, hey, you're successfully balanced, or no, that's out of balance, therefore your system collapses. I think this does a better job of explaining sort of the waxing and waning of social interests and focus. And the interesting thing about it, and this is, I think this was one of the things I spent, I always struggle. It's like the title is often the last thing that sort of comes to light for me. You read something, you're like, oh, I see what we're doing with the title there. That's cute. That's fun. But the idea that all of this understanding that we get about the success or failure of empires is always in the rearview mirror, because these aren't the kind of things you can see or necessarily
Hmm.
predict, because the interaction of these three forces, you can't see, like you almost have to see that in hindsight, because everything is in relation to everything else.
Um,
Does that make
except
sense?
it does make sense, except in his appendix, he breaks from his system now. But we
That
can let's return to this
Yeah.
because his appendix, his in the appendix, not to get too far ahead, but in the appendix to Minerva's Owl, Innes suggests a way of getting out of the contemporary crisis that he is diagnosing. We're going to get to that at that's basically where we want to get to tonight,
Mhm.
everyone. Um, but what's interesting is that he does have a kind of rationalist or confidence, I'll put it that way. He has a kind of confidence that he can indeed diagnose the current moment. So I'm agreeing with you. I think one of the strong points is that it's the whole point of Minerva's Owl, right?
Mhm.
That
Mhm.
wisdom is migratory. Like by the time Minerva Owl flies, it's because it's leaving.
Right.
You only have that kind of vantage point at the terminus
But
of a
see, I think
particular
that
moment.
that's kind of my point, and that's why I can look. I think you and I both get to the conclusion in the appendix and say something to the effect of, "Oh, buddy, you were good until you stepped there," right?
Right, right.
And but I think that's what I like about it, is that you can still project a theory or a hypothesis about a current situation with a degree of confidence
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
and be wrong, and
Mm-hmm.
have the
Oh,
formula still work.
Well, Michael, let's start though before we get to our roaring finish. And in order to set up a little bit further uh, and sort of establish the main premises of Innes's work and the argument in Minerva's Owl, I wanted to sort of share with everyone how I discovered Harold Innis, and it's relevant. So I'm teaching a H. Rider Haggard novel. It's been a hoot. It's crazy. It's a crazy little book. And I was reading Aaron Worth's wonderful study, Imperial Media, Colonial Networks, and Information Technologies in the British Literary Imagination, 1857, I believe, to 1918. A 2014 book. And Aaron Worth, at the very beginning of his study of Marie Corelli and H. Rider Haggard, two late Victorian novelists, he has this excursus. Any modern attempt, and I should say that in general, the book is about, as you would expect, imperial media and how Victorian Empire, British Victorian Empire, was built on the invention of certain new communication devices like the telegram. And also he includes among these technologies, obviously, photography, the telegram, and also the phonograph. Okay. And cinema. Did I mention cinema? Yes, cinema. Any modern attempt, and then Worth has this passage that kind of got me intrigued about Innes. Any modern attempt, Worth writes, to chart the relationship between media technologies and the spatio-temporal matrices associated with particular imperial systems owes a debt, however indirect, to the work of Canadian economic historian Harold Innis. In a pair of highly suggestive, if hardly pellucid works, written at the end of what had to that point been a more or less conventional scholarly career, Innis elaborated a boldly original theory of history, premised upon, and this is what we were alluding to at the very beginning of the episode, premised upon the determining power of media. And there we're kind of in McLuhan territory, right? Premise upon the determining power of media, and particularly upon the tendency of media to shape imperial systems. Actually, in Minerva's Owl, I think it's fair to say, and Michael, you were already alluding to it, um, it's not just empire, it's any kind of governing system.
Right.
But certainly, there is no possibility of imperial reach or imperial ventures without suitable technologies, suitable communication technologies. That's basically the Innis thesis and the Innis argument. Okay, back to work. These texts, and I think I misnamed this, so thank you, Aaron, for correcting me. These texts, Empire, not Empire in Media, which I think I said earlier, uh, Empire in Communication, 1950, and The Bias of Communication, 1951. We're talking about a 47 48 text, presidential address, and an appendix that would get collected into the latter book, The Bias of Communication. These texts argued, back to Worth, among other things, that the destinies of particular empires are rooted in their dependence upon technologies of communication that tilt toward control of, respectively, space or time. And here's the crucial distinction that he worries over, and will talk about in, I think, just in a minute, that he worries over between space-oriented media and time-oriented media. But here, Worth helpfully kind of gives you a sense of what Innis means by that distinction. Empires, quote, empires whose power is largely predicated upon the mastery of space-based media, the light portable documents of the Roman Imperium, for instance, tend to be expansionist because they can be. I think that's the implication, is that if you have portable means of communication, you can expand
Well, I
because your
think
message can control
I think
Uh,
it's more than that. I think if you have
yeah,
portable means of communication,
yeah, uh-huh,
then your communication will be portable. Ergo, you don't have a choice but to expand. It is, I mean, this is the whole point about the media systems
mhm,
shape or the power being determined and shaped
mhm,
by the media systems. Whatever your dominant mode or means of
mhm.
communication or a communication system might look like, that is going to determine the way that your culture functions.
Let me finish reading this paragraph because we might have a disagreement on this very point.
Oh, that's fun.
Yeah, or and it may not be worth talking about, but let me finish this point. So
Yeah.
now, because we're going to be able to, this will allow us to get right into Minerva's hour.
Okay.
Okay, um, where are we here? Blah, 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 blah. Roman Imperium, such as the light portable documents of the Roman Imperium, for instance. These empires tend to be expansionist, exerting influence over vast stretches of territory, but also doomed to collapse because insufficiently grounded in time based media, in tradition. So the contrast is with, back to Worth, those media, uh, those empires rather, on the other hand, most characterized, sorry, by the use of time-based media, parentheses, the grave and stone and spoken word of Egypt, for instance, relatively immobile technologies fostering respect for tradition may not sprawl like Rome, but they will tend to endure. The most notable systems for Innis, as we were referring to, as we mentioned earlier, the most stable systems, including the most stable imperial systems for Innis, are those that balance, that achieve a balance between the spatial and the temporal orientation.
Right. So he's arguing there that there's always a tension between the space based and the time based, right?
Mhm,
And for him, the time based cultures are the oral cultures. Those are the ones that tend to focus much more locally. They
mhm,
are more bound by a shared tradition, a shared
mhm,
understanding, a
mhm.
shared storytelling, right? The
But in the
spa-
case of okay, this go ahead and finish. I just realized it may not be worth talking about, but I think I understand what I was
okay, well, just
my
briefly then.
my
I won't.
criticism, what you were saying. Yeah, but
I
go
will
ahead.
try not to drag this out. The space based cultures, those are the cultures that are he talks about light portable. That's the discussion
Yeah,
Minerva's
right,
all
right,
about paper,
right,
for
right,
example, right?
right.
This is an offshoot of the mechanization of I guess and it is a growth of one that space-based focus
Mhm,
is what I think that is another way of saying that his understanding of the balanced interaction of power, knowledge, and truth
mhm, mhm,
is time-based. And that when you start to introduce overly economic concerns, overly technological concerns, when one of these gets to the forefront, we
mhm,
now create a space base because that's going to travel in the name of economics. I mean, he is concerned with the economic
right,
realities
right, right,
here, right? So
right.
when you have advancements in these ways, things that the time-based cultures aren't terribly concerned with, the time-based culture is more concerned with sustainability.
Mhm,
When you
mhm,
shift to a space-based um, focus here, now economics becomes a part. You start to have
mhm,
growth, expansion, that dilutes the centrality. It dilutes the shared concern. It starts to create a multiplicity of voices and issues that are not shared, that are
mhm,
individual to their own places, but are now in
mhm,
communication with each other. That's where that weakening becomes a thing.
mhm. Well, I don't find anything
So
exceptional
where
in. I'm not finding anything exceptional in what you're saying. I like all that. So, what was my? Maybe my disagreement or the disagreement I thought I was having a couple minutes ago had to do with something I'm sort of puzzling out from his account in Minerva's Owl
Which what?
of
Okay.
Egyptian culture, because it seems as if the thing about Egyptian culture is that it's never an oral culture. It's never an oral culture. Or rather, it only lately gets at later point in history, it gets oral. That one of the characteristics of these time-bound media empires is that the mode of communication, cuneiform, requires a specialist priestly class, so that both power and the mode of communication is incredibly local. But local doesn't mean diversity of opinion. Local means you got an elite that has a stranglehold on everything, on the
Hmm.
production of knowledge, on the production of political power, on the mode of communication. So I don't know. Yeah.
But
So
see, I think that
yeah,
that same circumstance holds in a lot of different areas. It's not about an how do I want to say it? Like it's not an egalitarian balance. It's a functional balance, right?
between
This
power, technology, and
and
technology.
knowledge.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Okay.
this has
Okay.
nothing to do with equality, I don't
Okay.
think. This
Okay.
has everything
Gotcha.
to
Gotcha.
do
Okay.
with a sustainable balance. And I think that's again,
Okay.
this is what I was saying earlier. I think this is what makes this really interesting to me is you could have a configuration of these three
Hmm.
that in a certain context is balanced, is sustainable,
Hmm.
right? And you could say, wow, it sucks to be on the bottom of that, or it's great to be on the top of that, but
Hmm.
there's a balance. What happens is when in any sort of balanced configuration, when something gets out of line, everything, because of the interrelatedness of these three, then shifts. And then Minerva's owl takes flight. And that might be a decent segue, quite frankly, to the appendix if you want.
I was about to say that. Let's do it.
So yeah, because here, yeah, okay, so this is I'm going to read a section from the beginning, a section from the middle, and then predictably a section from the end, and we can just sort of fill in the necessary blanks.
Yeah.
I think that if we get too caught up in everything,
And
um,
and let me just say two
yeah.
or three sentences. I'll keep it limited so you can go directly into the appendix. But we probably should just sort of note, let's do a very kind of quick review of the major ideas in Minerva's Owl, or rather, let's just highlight what we said, that media makes a difference. Communication technologies matter in terms of the
Well,
functioning of power and knowledge, right?
let's linger on that for just one second, okay?
Okay,
Because I
please.
think it's important to talk for a second about how and why media
Okay,
has this sort of effect where other institutions may not.
okay,
And as I understand it, Barry, the reason that communication technologies or media technologies are so impactful is because that is in either a space or a time based culture, either a
indeed,
mechanized or an oral based culture. Your media is the means through which these narratives which hold things together, this is the medium
absolutely.
through which they are communicated, right?
And what we talk about as culture in Innis's very innovational, let's give it, I
Mm-hmm.
have my criticisms, but let's give him credit. Typically, we would talk about what you just described as culture, right?
Right.
And he is basically saying media is the driver of culture, that you almost can't separate them. Yeah.
Yes, yes. And yeah, without getting into the weeds, I'll say there's a lot of very interesting means that he ties fairly adroitly to economics, to
Yeah.
information, knowledge,
Right.
like all
Right.
it is that media, and I think this is probably worth pointing out here, right? That as the determining power, media has a foothold in each of these three camps,
Absolutely.
right? So
Absolutely.
media, in terms of what was it, power, knowledge, and technology. I don't want to say that media is defining these things, but it's interesting. For example, like your that knowledge based system, for example, that's going to determine. Well, he talks about science in the appendix, for example. We're not
Hmm.
going to talk about this, right? But science and the focus of science and the advancement of science is going to determine what gets communicated about science. So
Exactly.
so
Right. So
each of
you can see how media is fitting in all those slots and all
Right,
those new
right.
things. Right. Yeah.
Those in power are going to communicate a certain message that is enabled
Exactly.
by their power,
Exactly.
right? The universities, the knowledge capitals are going to determine what gets communicated. So it's not a case that everything is communicated freely, or that there's overt censorship.
Excellent.
It's that
Excellent
every
point.
pillar will use the media will communicate in its best interest.
Excellent point. Okay, so just one last thing, but thank you for that because I
Yeah.
think that's an excellent sort of summary now that allows us to go in the appendix. I just want to say that the appendix is written a year after the address
Hmm.
before you go into it, because I think this is worth noting. It's written a year after the address. It's an attempt to talk about the particular Cold War, post World War II moment. And as Michael will make very clear, he is very much thinking about America's place. Well, he's thinking about the New World Order, to use that term. He's thinking about the New World Order after the atom bomb has been, detonated in 1948, and he's thinking about what basically global hegemony looks like and he's meditating on the power of science and the power of American science within this configuration.
Yeah. So in terms of his little metaphor for empires change, or the
Mm-hmm.
Minerva's owl, in terms of where in
Mm-hmm.
flight or in perch the owl is. He's really, I think he's understanding that the world is at a turning place, right? Like
World is a
you
turning
do,
point. Yeah.
the atomic bomb is very clearly a symbol that we are not where we were, and his concern with America, obviously, as the country that the design, manufactured, and dropped the bomb. We're seeing now, okay, both the locus of power, and arguably the locus of knowledge and technology, all being shifted away from, or I
Beautiful.
don't want to say away from,
Right.
but into an American sphere of
Right.
what's the word I'm looking for here?
Amer- Away from the American
No,
sphere,
no,
or I
no,
didn't
not at
hear
all away from.
away
Certainly
into the
into
American sphere.
the American
Mhm.
sphere of
Hegemony, influence.
influence was the word I was looking for. So,
Okay.
anyways, so that's the talk. And so he's sitting sort of in that liminal space between what was and what may be.
That's beautifully put. Okay, and I don't want to interrupt you from this, but just one more Philip,
Do it.
because it's important because it's going to help you, I
Yeah.
think, go through it. Is that when we talked about Marshall McLuhan, we have a big difference between oral cultures and print cultures, right? And that's McLuhan's one of McLuhan's guiding ideas. It's still one of his legacy ideas. That idea is here.
Yes.
It's important to say that that idea is basically articulated already here in this 1948 address. And it's going to sort of guide his comments and direct his comments in the appendix that Michael's going to read.
Okay. So we're gonna, as I said, there's three sections because Barry and I are working on becoming the kings of brevity and focus. So here we go.
Let's do it.
He says, mechanization this is the very opening of the appendix. Mechanization has emphasized complexity and confusion. It has been responsible for monopolies in the field of knowledge. It becomes extremely important to any civilization, if it is not to succumb to the influence of this monopoly of knowledge, to make some critical survey and report. Science, technology, and the mechanization of knowledge are in grave danger of destroying the conditions of freedom of thought, and in destroying the conditions of freedom of thought, bringing about the collapse of what we like to think of as Western civilization.
Indeed.
So, mechanization is problematic. And when he speaks of mechanization, Barry, I understand this to be um, a shift again away from the primarily oral communication. This is a shift into a a tech heavy.
Well, I mean, just the fact that paper, I mean, what happens in the 19th century, the rise of newspapers, which is mechanized, right? That machine production of paper now becomes, becomes cheap. And so therefore, that's what allows the plethora of newsprint. So yeah, that's mechanical
Right.
production.
Okay.
Right.
So this next section is a bit long, so please feel free to jump in. I know you have opinions here, so let's
I
don't.
want to be moderate about this, and in the spirit of brevity, and also in the spirit of tact and friendliness toward our Canadian neighbors.
We need to be kind.
Exactly.
In the remainder of this paper, I shall be concerned with an interest in the economic history of knowledge, in which dependence on the work of Graham Wallas will be evident. He pointed to the danger that knowledge was growing too vast for successful use in social judgment, since life is short and sympathies and intellects are limited. Skip down. He assumed the creative thought was dependent on the oral tradition and that the conditions favorable to it were gradually disappearing with the increasing mechanization of knowledge. And we've spoken
Which
of
is what
this
we're
already.
talking about. Right.
Reading is quicker than listening and concentrated individual thought, than verbal exposition and counter exposition of arguments. The printing press and the radio address the world instead of the individual. And again, that's his push back against mechanization.
Mechanization, right.
The oral dialectic is overwhelmingly significant to subjects whose subject matter is human action and feeling, and is important in the discovery of new truth, but is of very little value in disseminating it. So again, there, just a quick summary. The argument here is that the orality brings us closer, makes us human, helps us discover new
Indeed.
truths, whereas it's not, as in a space-based culture, concerned with breadth.
The expansive distribution of the news of the same message across a large territory.
Right. So basically, orality is good and kind and feels like a hug, and mechanization is an uncaring slap to the face.
If I have a moment to interject, but I don't want to
You do,
interrupt you.
absolutely.
It Here's my interjection. Michael, doesn't he just want a podcast? I'm not specific.
No.
I'm not being facetious. I'm not being facetious. Now wait a minute. Here's how I understand the oral tradition. The oral, yes, I know. Podcasts have this obviously they have the mechanical dissemination, right? That he is complaining about, right?
Right.
But hear me out. Going back to the Wallace statement you read, right? That Wallace statement, I mean, here's how I parse out the Wallace statement that he's building this on is that in an age, it's a little bit like Michael, put your mind back, think back to the summer, think of Walter Benjamin, the storyteller. Remember that Benjamin talks about that older world that was destroyed by World War One, where people just sat around and they talked story and they told stories and they listened to the storyteller. And the whole point of that is that it was just like this time was of no essence, right? No matter. It was just like this endless sort of lingering.
See, I
And
feel it.
so there's a kind of, let me just finish
Yeah,
the
yeah,
point
yeah.
that this idea that what I think he is saying is that when I hear my news on the radio, I don't have to think about it anymore. And I don't have to talk to you about it. I could just say, I mean, I can talk about it with you, but I'll just basically repeat what I already heard. Whereas if I'm having a dialogue with you, that's going to be this creative opportunity for creative, innovative, improvisational knowledge. And isn't that what he's missing?
Sort of. I think he might argue that he'd love to have a seat on this podcast, for example. But the
He would.
problem, oh, of course. But the problem is, I think he would feel immense guilt by being a part of any podcast because aren't we all just part of that technological
Sure,
like
sure,
right? Because the
sure,
problem is
sure.
we're talking about that's an interesting choice because on one hand, absolutely, you and I are talking about concerns that are so incredibly local to our
Who are
world,
right,
right?
right.
The problem is if you are in a different part of the world and listening to this because, isn't that interesting because that's different and I want to learn about this new different thing.
Mm-hmm.
If you don't have an immediate local connection to it, then we are the problem, not
Okay.
the solution.
I don't want to linger on that. I just wanted to bring
That's
that
an
up and see
interesting,
your
that's an
thought.
interesting
Yeah.
complication. I don't know. Anyway, he says the oral dialectic is overwhelmingly significant to subjects whose subject matter is human action and feeling and is important in the discovery of new truth, but is very little value disseminating it. I push back a little bit because this is dissemination.
Yeah. Gotcha.
The oral discussion inherently involves personal contact and a consideration for the feelings of others. It is in sharp contrast with the cruelty of mechanized communication and the tendencies which we have come to note in the modern world.
Why is mechanized knowledge or whatever his word is? Why is it cruel?
Because I don't feel
Because there's no
it doesn't
improvisation, there's no innovation, there's
that and
no.
it doesn't linger. It can't actually
Oh,
invest itself in the local. That would
okay.
be my answer to that. I mean, this is,
Okay.
we're gonna move on. We're gonna move on now, and there's no that, and that's cruel.
Okay.
Quantitative pressure of modern knowledge has been responsible for the decay of oral dialectic and conversation.
Okay. Right.
The passive reading of newspapers and newspaper placards, and the small number of significant magazines and books point to the dominance of conversation by the newspaper and to the pervasive influence of discontinuity, which is, of course, the characteristic of the newspaper as it is of the dictionary.
It's so funny that, I mean, I think we talked about McLuhan's many echoes of Walter Benjamin, which I think were totally there was no informed reading, or I don't think McLuhan read Benjamin. But I feel the same way about Innes. Everything you just read, I think, could have been taken from the storyteller just right now. That last sentence about that, I could imagine Benjamin throwing that into the storyteller.
Mhm. Mhm. Did you want to linger any longer? Shall we
No,
go through the
no,
last?
no, 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 no.
Okay, so we're now approaching the last section here.
Yes, sir.
He says we are compelled to recognize the significance of mechanized knowledge as a source of power and its subjection to the demands of force through the instrument of the state. The universities are in danger of becoming a branch of the military arm. The problem of universities in the British Commonwealth is to appreciate its implications and to attack, in a determined fashion, the problems created by a neglect of the position of culture in Western civilization. Centralization in education in the interests of political organization has disastrous implications.
Okay.
Um, the last bit, and then we can come back and talk about what the
Sure.
university is doing wrong. Culture, as according to Innis, excuse me, culture survives ideologies and political institutions, or rather, it subordinates them to the influence of constant criticism. Constant whining about the importance of our way of life is foreign to its temper. The universities should subject their views about their role in civilization to systematic overhauling and revise the machinery by which they can take a leading part in the problems of Western culture. For example, We should extend our scholarships to universities on the continent. Lecturers should be encouraged to write books as a means of compelling them to give new lectures. The universities must concern themselves with the living rather than the dead. And that is how he ends his appendix.
And so the universities are currently part of the problem because they have let's do some glosses here in our final moments here. The universities are part of the problem. Why? Well, partly they have adopted the mechanized mode of instruction, or they're preparing students for entry into the mechanized mode of production.
Well,
What is the
I
problem?
think the problem with the university,
What's the current problem, and then what's his solution?
yes, is not that they're preparing students, is not so much that they're preparing students for anything.
Mm-hmm.
It's that they're failing
Two.
failing in their purpose of educating students
Mm-hmm.
because the universities have become mechanized. We have focused, and he talks a bit this, and we didn't get into this, but about how they've shifted their focus away from dialectic and into the examination and the textbook. And you see that this is interesting. I mean, I found this really compelling because we see this now, most certainly, right? This is still a problem that has not been addressed.
Sure.
That we are more factory, we are more, they're too large. They've become factories as opposed to places for, as you could probably guess, right? Orality. We're no longer discussing, we're no longer talking. He says we can't effectively educate more than like 12 students at a time. And that's the problem, is that we're caught up in, we've become too much entwined with the technology and the power components of culture and haven't effectively learned to stand independently. That's my read of this. How do you take it?
Um,
Not stand
I
independently. That's, let me revise that real quick. It's not that it should ever be independent. It's just that the universities are too caught up in the rest of mechanized culture and have lost their
no,
way.
I think I'm with you and Innes on that totally. My problem, and I don't know if I have a real articulate critique of this, but my problems actually, let's for my closing bit, I I would I would point to the last two sentences and reread them and say that I don't quite know what he means or what they mean. And that's my issue here.
So,
So after diagnosing the problem, I think I'm buying his diagnosis of the problem. And that if anything, in 2025, the problems that he was noting in terms of the university having perhaps uh, um, matters of evaluation, rubrics, things like this that are sort of counter to creative, innovative dialogue, the strengths of the oral communication. But I'll just read these two sentences. So I guess I'm on board with Innes. But then when I think of his proposed solutions, I honestly, and I'm not saying this in the snotty, and you know me, I'm very capable of doing this. Like, I don't know what that means. You know, I can say that in a snotty way that implies that Innes doesn't really know what he's talking about because I have no idea what he means. And what that means is he doesn't have anything to say. I'm not saying that, but I will still make that kind of criticism here. Um, I literally don't understand why. Okay, point one, lecturers should be encouraged to write books as a means of compelling them to give new lectures. Okay, I think I understand what's going on there.
how do you read
Um,
that?
well, I think what he's saying is that's his nod to the oral tradition, but
Yes.
that if I'm writing a book in order to inspire my new lecture, that means I am aligning myself with a creative force, and I'm not simply regurgitating, repackaging information for students to regurgitate and, passively assimilate.
I think that's right. I think that's right.
But but he I guess I'm too much of a Heideggerian. Heidegger would say thinking can't be instrumentalized in this particular way. Writing a book, it's counterintuitive to the idea of the oral dialogue and the creative moments that occur in an oral dialogue that I think he's really getting at. And this idea of tying it to the production of anything, I think is the killer. He doesn't realize that if you tie the production of the new to a new commodity object, the book,
Mm-hmm.
that
Oh,
what you've done is you've entered the mechanism system.
okay. So I see this. This clears some stuff up for me. I've been kind of puzzled as to why you're bristling. I see this a little bit differently. I don't think that Innes gives a toss whether or not you write a new book. What he cares about is that you give a new lecture. And I think but I definitely buy your take here, right? That if we,
It's problematic that he okay, I buy
yes,
that. When you say
yes,
that, then I say I'm all for him,
the
right?
means to an end are problematic here.
But it's
What
problematic the way
what
he
he
formulates it.
wants is new, localized, relevant
Gotcha.
discussion. And that's
Gotcha.
why we want to be extending scholarships to universities on the continent. Let's try and
I
keep
gotcha.
things local,
I
right?
gotcha.
This is a very pro-Canadian approach here.
But that's a problematic formulation for that particular remedy. So, okay,
Well,
number one.
okay,
Well, I think
okay.
problematic because to me, and maybe I'm just using the 2025 university administrative lens to look at that. But when I see somebody saying you can't be a lecturer anymore, what you really need to do is you need to be tied to the production mill because the production, your book production is what's going to make you the fresh lecturer. Then I think what you've created is another mode of assessment. What you've created is another arm of what William James
Oh,
called
I
at the
get it.
very beginning of the 20th
I
century
get
the
it.
PhD octopus.
Yes. No, I get it. Look, if you want to teach here, you better be publishing, right? Because and which is very much concerned with outside eyes. But
Outside eyes.
I don't think
He means that.
that that's what he's after.
Okay.
And the
Final
reason I'm
point.
willing to
Yeah.
say that is
Yeah.
because of how
Yeah.
he ends.
Okay, well, that's where I want to go, and that's where I want to end. So you're going to help me with this. That's the other sentence I don't quite understand. The universities must concern themselves with the living rather than with the dead. How the hell can an economic historian end his meditation in that way? How the hell?
Well,
What the hell is going on?
um okay, so again, I'm not trying to be the Innes apologist here, but I think that that final sentence is his nod to the penultimate sentence, right? We need to be
Please.
having discussions about things that are now. We
Ooh,
don't need to be having discussions about things that were then and elsewhere, right? So he is again writing on the cusp of a sea change and he knows it and he's concerned with it. And he's saying we need to be looking about where we are now. And that means we can't be talking about the dead. We can't be talking about the past. We have to be looking and we have to be rooted in the present. I'm getting
so,
for those of
so
you not privy to Barry's physical response to this, I'm getting
what? I
I'm
don't think
getting
I
a
have.
nod, which I'm taking as approval here. Like, how do you not do you see that differently?
Uh, I'm struggling to see it, and no, I mean struggle not in the bad sense. Like I'm struggling and failing, but I'm trying. What you're suggesting to me, and I'm trying to think about
Mm-hmm.
it, is that you're saying that basically, and it would make sense. This whole paragraph I think I may have read this paragraph uncharitably,
He wants to
thinking
make
that
Canada great again.
he wants to make Canada great again, and I'm all for that. Um, but I thought that maybe there was a multi-point. Maybe I misread this paragraph. I mean, seriously,
Okay.
because I read this paragraph as kind of his multi-point program. Multi-point. That's the crucial thing. Multi-point program for making Canada great again, for making Canadian, okay, not being facetious, for making Canadian universities responsive, which he believes they need to be, making them responsive to present day
Well,
exigencies
think so what it says.
rather than the past.
He
But
wants he wants to
yeah,
revise the machinery by which they can take a leading part in the problems of Western culture.
right, right. So I was reading as a multi-part thing, and I wasn't sure how these different parts that I thought were differentiated were differentiated, and so I wasn't sure about his machinery, in other words. But what you're suggesting is that this is a kind of general ending where he's saying, "Okay, I got my goal. My goal is getting the university." It's that last sentence is really the goal. The universities need to concern themselves with the present day exigency
Mm-hmm.
rather than the past, the rote retelling of the past.
Yes, that's what I think.
Well, that's a wonderful, sunny way of, I think, wrapping up our episode.
I think so. Okay. Well, Bear, I want to say again, thank you. I do believe I'm a Harold Innis fan, and I hope that this isn't the last we speak of him or his.
I'm sure it won't be.
All
I'm
right,
sure it won't be. There are at least two books to explore.
there you go. Well, yeah, he died. He died tragically. He died young. Um, well,
And the
let's.
media turn, it's worth noticing, Aaron Worth noted this, that he makes the media turn late.
Mhm. Well, I hope we revisit it. I know that there's so much to unpack here. So yeah, all right. Well, let's see what we can do in our part to avoid the demise of Western culture and
All right.
civilization. And
Yeah, good.
until then, Barry, I'll see you next time. Thank you again.
Thank you again.
Thanks for listening to the Critical Media Studies podcast. To find out more about the show, check out our webpage at criticalmediastudiespodcast.com.